Hello, everyone, and welcome to this short talk on behalf of the Royal Hospital for Neuro-disability, or the RHN for short. My name is Katherine Szentgyorgyi, and I've been the archivist at the RHN for going on 3 years now. During the talk, I'm going to give you the briefest of histories about the hospital. And then, as we're focusing on ancestors who may have been patients here, I'm going to let you know about the information that we hold about patients within our archive and how to go about accessing that information. So, firstly, what kind of hospital is the RHN? Well, it's an independent medical charity based in southwest London, and it was established back in 1854. Nowadays, it provides care for people with disabilities due to brain injury or neurological illness. The hospital is split between two main services. The first is the brain injury unit for people who need complex rehabilitation or for those with prolonged disorders of consciousness. The second is a specialist nursing home for people with physical disabilities or cognitive behavioral needs. We have capacity of around 200 beds, and the vast majority of new admissions are short stay rehab patients in our brain injury unit. But let's rewind to the 19th century when we were first established. And any discussion about the history of the RHN needs to start with our founder, Reverend Andrew Reid. And here he is looking very distinguished. But who exactly was he? Well, he was a renowned clergyman and philanthropist of the day. He founded his first charity, the London Orphan Asylum, in 1813, which can be seen on the bottom left of this circular here. This was followed by two further orphanages, a hospital for people with learning difficulties, a grammar school, as well as a savings bank. He was an extraordinary man who contributed many years' service to these charities, whilst also being a full-time minister to his church. The Royal Hospital for Incurables, which was the original name for the hospital, can be seen on the bottom right. The rather contentious word incurable wasn't actually dropped from the hospital's title until 1995. But on a basic level, it merely referred to patients with long-term conditions where there was no known cure. To understand why the hospital was set up, we need to fully appreciate the healthcare situation at that time. In the mid-19th century, a lot of progress was being made in the prevention and treatment of infectious disease, and mortality rates were declining through the adoption of antiseptic procedures and anesthesia in operating theatres, for example. However, there was very little improvement in the care and treatment of patients suffering from chronic disability. General hospitals were simply not able to spare beds where there was little or no hope of recovery. And sadly, such patients had to rely on the support and aid of their family and friends. There was a very famous catalyst for change whom you may well recognize, the novelist Charles Dickens. Charles Dickens actually wrote a short article admonishing the lack of care and facilities for incurable patients. He wrote, "There are hospitals for the cure of every possible ailment or disease known to suffering humanity, but not one for the reception of persons past cure." The need for such an institution came to the attention of Andrew Reid. Luckily, he was a very well-connected man and he was adept at securing financial support for his charities. Amongst his supporters were various members of the royal family, politicians, and grandees from the City of London, and monies were quickly raised to fund the hospital. The Royal Hospital for Incurables was established just 4 years after Charles Dickens's article was written. It was officially inaugurated on 31st of July 1854 at Mansion House, chaired by the Lord Mayor of London. Various resolutions were passed, including the following. If any evidence was required of the necessity of such an institution, it would be found in the number of persons who applied for relief at existing hospitals and were refused because their illness was so long-standing, or who were discharged because they were incurable, or their case would take up so long a time. The hospital initially set up in a house in Carshalton and then in a more spacious mansion on Richmond Road. But very quickly, there was a need for a larger and more permanent venue. Andrew Reed was keen on a site in Coulsdon, and he sought the opinion of several contemporary experts on hospital design, one of whom is another 19th century celebrity, Florence Nightingale. Florence Nightingale responded with several letters on the proposed site of the hospital, offering advice on subjects such as the amounts of air and light required by patients, the size of wards, and the need for day and exercise rooms. A page from one of her letters is copied here, and they are the absolute treasures of our archive collections. Despite Andrew Reed favouring Coulsdon, the hospital purchased its current premises in June 1863, which was a year after his death. This final move provided the hospital with a spacious estate where it could continue to expand to meet the ever-increasing number of patients and provide the clean air and countryside vista, which was seen as beneficial to health and recuperation. Now, the estate can be traced back to 1759, when the wife of George Pitt, the Whig MP, built a small house or retreat. The grounds were converted by Lancelot Capability Brown, the eminent landscape architect. The retreat was demolished in 1786, but a new three-story mansion called Melrose Hall was commissioned around 1789. The mansion passed through several owners over the next 70 years, including the wealthy Duke of Sutherland, until the hospital purchased the building and 23 acres of land for a modest £18,000. The site still incorporates the original mansion, including the library and reception area with the distinctive Georgian features that you can see here on the right. But you're probably wondering about our patients. At first, the hospital provided care for two types of patients. The majority were referred to as pensioners, which is what we would now term outpatients, and they were cared for at home by their families whilst receiving a monthly allowance and medical visits. The number of pensioners peaked at around 700 in the 1920s and then declined before being completely discontinued in 1952. Though once on the list, pensioners had the reassurance that they would be supported for the rest of their lives, with the last of our outpatients actually dying in the 1990s. Inpatients, on the other hand, were at first referred to as inmates, which kind of suggests that they were confined involuntarily. On the contrary, places, as I shall explain in a moment, were quite hard to obtain. The numbers of patients residing at the hospital were up to 200 by 1890, and as mentioned previously, this figure is largely maintained to this present day. And here are some lovely lantern slides of the wards and the patients in the late 19th century. So in order to be admitted, patients had the choice of giving payment, which was originally £25 for those of limited means, or £50 for those who were more affluent. More commonly, they would go through a process of election. Some patients were rejected because they were minors, if they were under 21 years old, or if they were paupers, who it was assumed were cared for in local workhouses. Patients who were accepted for election were placed on an electoral list, which subscribers would be asked to vote on biannually. And here you can see an appeal for votes for a potential outpatient. This voting system remained in place until 1950. Similar systems were used by orphanages and other medical charities, but it was rather controversial. One critic wrote, "The result of this system is that friends have to incur much expenditure in postage, in printing, in canvassing, and other ways, and that almost necessarily in consequence, the sufferings of the incurable case is increased." If you have an ancestor with a chronic condition or illness, then you're probably thinking whether the hospital would have accepted them as patients. As a guide, this slide shows the conditions of the first 100 applicants to the hospital between 1854 and 1855. There was a wide range of diagnoses, but the majority, as you can see, fall into the categories of paralysis, rheumatism, and spinal injury. It is somewhat surprising that several cases of infectious diseases, such as consumption and bronchitis, nervous disorders such as melancholia and hysteria, and also blindness were considered, as these conditions were not within the admission criteria of the institution. This criteria was not strictly enforced, as several such applicants did end up being admitted. So if you're not sure, it's always worth checking with us. And clearly, what was incurable in the 19th century is very different to what was incurable in the 20th century and beyond. To compare, this slide shows the conditions of applicants to the hospital 100 years later, between 1954 and 1955. We can see that neurological disease was fast becoming the major cause for application to the hospital. We can also see the emergence of Parkinson's and Huntington's diseases and conditions like epilepsy no longer appearing due to the availability of new medications. We have a wide range of material in our archive, including minute books, fundraising appeals, photographs, and artifacts. But if you're trying to trace your ancestor, our admission casebooks are going to be of most interest to you. We have a complete set of volumes containing details of all applicants to the hospital, not just those who were admitted, for the period 1854 to 1993. The page shown here relates to our very first patient who was elected, Julia Relf. The details for each applicant include name, date of birth, residence, illness or injury, duration of the illness or injury, means of support, whether admission was by election or payment, securities, which normally gives the names and addresses of family or next of kin, length of occupancy, and where appropriate, date of death. So this covers quite a lot of genealogical data, even for patients who were unsuccessful in gaining admission. As a voluntary specialist hospital, most patients were from the middle classes, as it was expected that the poorer classes would go to the workhouse or poor law infirmaries. And whilst the hospital was always based in London, it attracted patients from throughout the UK. The casebook showed patients originating from as far as Kirkcaldy to Guernsey. So how exactly can you access these casebooks and other RHN records? Well, we do have an online catalogue at the webpage shown here on the bottom left. Our earliest casebooks have been digitised, but they're in the process of being indexed. So for this reason, you won't be able to download the pages online. If you'd like to inquire about an ancestor, please do contact us direct and we will undertake any searches and provide you with copies of any relevant entries that we find. Though for records less than 100 years old, we obviously need to be mindful of GDPR. Sadly, this brings me to the end of my video. I do hope that you found it interesting and helpful. Here are my contact details. Please feel free to send me an email, and here's our Twitter account as well. It would be wonderful if you could give us a follow to get updates on talks or events to do with the RHN's archive. Thank you very much for listening, and I do hope that you enjoy all the other fascinating events as part of All About That Place.